Good morning. Today we're going to continue dealing with the central nervous system. And just to remind you that last time we dealt with the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So today we will deal with the brain and cranial nerves. Brain and cranial nerves topic will last for 2 lectures. So this is the first part 1 of the brain and cranial nerves. Probably I will not mention anything today about cranial nerves. I will concentrate mainly on the brain. And next time we will introduce something about cranial nerves. But as a definition, cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, which consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So the cranial nerves are the nerves that are directly connected to the brain, while the spinal nerves, as you have seen last time, are the 31 pairs of nerves that are connected to the spinal cord, but cranial nerves are 12 pairs of cranial nerves and they are connected to the brain. So this is the brain. Actually it is a half brain, and this is a sagittal section of a half brain, and you can see the parts of the brain. It consists of the cerebrum. So this is the cerebrum. The cerebrum actually consists of 2 cerebral hemispheres. So this is one and this is the other one. So there are 2 hemispheres, and this is only one cerebral hemisphere, so the cerebrum. And then there's the diencephalon. That's the region of the diencephalon. It consists of a thalamus and part below it, which is called the hypothalamus. And then we have the posteriorly and inferiorly is the cerebellum. Cerebellum means a small brain. So that's the cerebellum. Again, the cerebellum is formed of 2 cerebellar hemispheres. And then we have a stem for that brain, which is called the brainstem. And the brainstem consists of 3 parts, as if that's a 3-story building. So the highest part is the midbrain, and then we have the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata continues down through foramen magnum, the big foramen in the occipital bone, as the spinal cord. So spinal cord becomes medulla oblongata, pons, and then the midbrain. And you can see here that the cerebellum is connected to the midbrain, posterior to the midbrain, and below the cerebrum. Again, you can see them here in this actual dissection of the brain. So that is the cerebrum here, and that's the region of the diencephalon with the thalamus and the hypothalamus, then midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and continues as the spinal cord. And here the cerebellum is connected to the back of the brainstem. These are the parts of the brainstem: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Again, as we mentioned last time, that we need protective coverings here. This is a neural tissue that is so delicate, and here it cannot regenerate itself. This is the central nervous system. So again, it's the same protective covering for the spinal cord. We have the meninges, we have the bone, meninges, and the fluid. So the bone is the skull, and the meninges are the 3 layers of meninges: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Again, the dura mater is the thick layer that is connected to the inside of the skull, or applied to the inside of the skull, and then deep to it is the arachnoid mater. This layer here is the arachnoid mater, and then below the arachnoid mater there is a space. You see, this is the space. It looks like a cobweb. So it has many partitions and threads inside it, and this space is the subarachnoid space, which contains the cerebrospinal fluid, and then comes the pia mater, which is directly applied to the substance of the brain. It's the same arrangement like that of the spinal cord. The pia mater is directly applied to the spinal cord, and then there is a space, subarachnoid space, and then the arachnoid is directly applied to the dura. So on one side it's dura, on the other side it's the arachnoid mater. And then the cerebrospinal fluid. We are going to talk about cerebrospinal fluid next time, but just to give you an idea that the cerebrospinal fluid, as you can see it here, it surrounds the entire brain, this blue area here, the blue fluid, and cerebro means surrounding the brain, cerebrum, and then goes down to surround the spinal cord. We have seen that last time. We said that it surrounds the spinal cord, and even it continues down. When the spinal cord ends at the level of L2, L1, L2, there is more cerebrospinal fluid until the level of S2, and this is the place where we can insert a needle and sample this cerebrospinal fluid. So it provides protection and buoyancy for the central nervous system. We're going to talk about its formation and drainage. It circulates actually. It's not stagnant. It's always circulating. So it's produced by arteries and drained by veins. We're going to talk about that next time. So I'm just mentioning it today as part of the protective coverings of the brain. Again, it's bone, meninges, and the fluid, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. So we will start with the medulla oblongata. This is to show you the brain from the inferior aspect. You can see again, these are the two cerebral hemispheres, and this is the cerebellum, two cerebellar hemispheres, and this is the region of the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and then the midbrain is not very clearly shown here. It's behind the pons, but it's actually above the pons, but not very clearly shown in this view. In this slide, we are mainly concerned about the medulla oblongata, and it is the continuation of the spinal cord. You can see here, this is the spinal cord. Look at the section here. Look at the butterfly shape of the gray matter, the H shape of the gray matter of the spinal cord that we talked about last time. And the medulla oblongata contains ascending and descending fibers. The ascending fibers are sensory, the descending fibers are motor. So there's a bunch of these ascending and descending fibers. In addition to that, the medulla oblongata contains a cardiovascular center, which controls the force and rate of heartbeat and the diameter of blood vessels. Of course, this control is involuntary control. So it controls the heart, the force of contraction, and the frequency of the or the rate of the heartbeat. And also there is the respiratory center. So there is which also controls the rhythmicity and of the respiration. When you are sitting now, you are unconscious of your respiration. Although the diaphragm is a voluntary muscle, you can increase and decrease the rate of respiration, but actually it is involuntarily controlled by a respiratory center, which is mainly present in the medulla oblongata. So this very small area contains so many structures, and that's why damage of this area of the brain can be fatal because it contains the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center. So damage of a very small area in it can be fatal. If there is damage of the ascending and descending fibers, then it might result in paralysis, loss of sensation. But the involvement of these vital centers, they call them, is fatal. On the ventral surface of the medulla, this is the ventral or the anterior surface of the medulla, you can see that there are two prominences. They look like pyramids, so that's why they are called the pyramids. In fact, they contain a bundle of axons, white matter. So these are descending fibers, motor fibers, large motor tract. And in the lower part of the medulla, you can see here, this is the upper part of the medulla. In the lower part of the medulla, this is a magnified section. So this is the upper part, here's the lower part. In the lower part of the medulla, these fibers will cross what we call decussate. So decussation means crossing from one side to another. And by this way, of course, the origin of these fibers being motor fibers is the cerebral cortex. And they are heading down to the spinal cord. So they cross, which means that one side of the brain has motor control over the contralateral side of the body. So the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, left side of the brain, the cerebral hemisphere, controls the left side of the body. And this is because of the crossing that takes place to the descending fibers. A major crossing of these fibers takes place in the medulla, where these fibers, the pyramidal fibers, or the fibers that are present in the pyramid, they cross in the medulla. Okay? So that's how the brain controls the contralateral side of the body. Posteriorly, this is the posterior aspect of the medulla here, from this point to this point. That's the extent of the medulla, because above that it will be the pons, and below it will be the spinal cord. So that's the extent of the medulla. You can see posteriorly that there are two prominences in the back of the medulla. Of course, two prominences on either side, 1, 2, and then 1, 2. And these are called the cuneate nucleus and the gracile nucleus, or nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. So the nucleus gracilis is the medial one, and the nucleus cuneatus is the lateral one. And these nuclei, they are concerned with sensory function. Please note that the term nucleus is used in the central nervous system, or in the nervous system in general. The term nucleus does not mean a nucleus of the cell. A nucleus here means a collection of nerve cell bodies. So if these nerve cell bodies are collected outside the central nervous system, they are called ganglia, like the dorsal root ganglia. If they are connected, they are present in the central nervous system, we use the term nucleus. So here, the nucleus doesn't mean a nucleus of a cell, it means collection of nerve cell bodies. Okay? So these nuclei are concerned with sensations, certain types of sensations. We are not going into details today because we are going to talk about the sensory system later on, but these, just to let you know that these nuclei, the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, are related to proprioception and vibration, sense of proprioception, pressure, and vibration. Proprioception means the sensation of location in space. Like, for example, I know now, even if my eyes are closed, that my elbow is flexed or my shoulder is abducted without looking at it. This is proprioception. Location at space, knowledge of the location at space. And this could be conscious and unconscious. So these nuclei are concerned with this type of sensation, and they are located at the back or posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata. And then we have the pons. This is the pons from the front, you can see it. And look at the location of the pons here. It is midway between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. And as you can see here, the pons, behind it is the cerebellum, and the pons is connected to the cerebellum by white matter, by fibers, which constitute what we call peduncles. So there are peduncles connecting the cerebellum to the brainstem. The peduncle that connects the cerebellum to the pons is called the middle cerebellar peduncle. These are fibers coming from the pons, mainly coming from the pons to the cerebellum. So it looks like as if here, it gives the impression like the pons, it looks like a bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres, and this is the origin of the term pons. Pons, pon, means bridge. So it's like a bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres. This gives the impression for the early anatomists that this works as a bridge between the cerebellar hemispheres. That's the origin of the name. And in addition to these fibers that connect the pons to the cerebellum, there are, of course, the ascending and descending fibers. These fibers, if they are ascending, then they ascend from the spinal cord, so they have to go to the medulla, and then to the pons, and then to the midbrain, and then they might reach the thalamus or continue up into the cerebral cortex. And the descending fibers also may have the same route. They descend down and go to the midbrain, to the pons, medulla, and to the spinal cord. So there are ascending and descending fibers as well in the pons, in addition to a group of nuclei. And these are called pontine nuclei. So a group of nuclei are located in the pons, and these nuclei are the nuclei that are connected to the cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncles. So again, the pons is a small area that contains ascending, descending fibers and contains connections with the cerebellum. And then we have the midbrain. So this is the region of the midbrain. It is between the pons and the diencephalon. And this is the posterior aspect of the midbrain. And in this section, you can see here the two cerebral hemispheres have been detached. They are connected, they are connected here, so they have been detached. And the cerebellum is detached as well. So you can only see the brainstem and the diencephalon above it. This part of the brainstem, the upper part of the brainstem, is the midbrain. It's located between the pons and the diencephalon. And you can see that posteriorly there are four circular bodies which are called the colliculi. So we have superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. We're going to talk about them later on. The superior colliculi are concerned with visual reflexes, and the inferior colliculi are concerned with auditory reflexes. This is if we look at the midbrain from behind. Okay, and in the center of the midbrain there is a narrow duct which is called the cerebral aqueduct. You can see here a section of the midbrain. This is a section of the midbrain. That's the posterior aspect, and you can see the colliculi. This is at the level of the superior colliculi. Below them are the inferior colliculi. Inside the midbrain, there is a narrow canal which is called the aqueduct. Aqueduct means water canal. Water is the cerebrospinal fluid, in fact. And this is part of the ventricular system of the brain. Again, I'm going into details of the cerebrospinal fluid and ventricular system next time, but it is good to know from now that there are four ventricles in the brain, cavities. These are cavities which contain cerebrospinal fluid. In fact, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced inside these cavities. So there are four. Two of these cavities, two of the four, are called the lateral ventricles. And then we have the third ventricle, which is one ventricle in the middle, and then which is present in the diencephalon. And then here, behind the brainstem, behind the pons and medulla, there is the fourth ventricle. So two lateral ventricles, then the third, and then the fourth, which is located behind the pons and the medulla oblongata. So in between the diencephalon and the pons, there's a narrow duct, aqueduct, that should traverse the midbrain. And this is the cerebral aqueduct. And then this ventricular system continues down into the central canal of the spinal cord, which I mentioned last time. Central canal, which contains the cerebrospinal fluid. This is in addition to the cerebrospinal fluid that is present in the subarachnoid space surrounding the brain and the spinal cord, because these ventricles are connected to the subarachnoid space. So returning back here to the midbrain contains the cerebral aqueduct that connects between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Third and fourth ventricle, in between them is the cerebral aqueduct, which is present in the midbrain. So anteriorly, in this section of the midbrain, you can see that there is, these are called the cerebral peduncles. So cerebral peduncles, not cerebellar, cerebral peduncles, and they contain descending fibers. The fibers that should descend down, they go into the pons, and then they go into the medulla. Just to remind you here, these fibers will descend through the midbrain, then into the pons, and then into the medulla. In the medulla, we have seen these fibers here in the pyramids, and then they will decussate and go down into the spinal cord. These are the same fibers that are present here in the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. And behind that, there's a dark area. You can see it if you have a section of the midbrain. If you cut the midbrain, you can look at it with your naked eye. It's dark black area. So that's why it's called the substantia nigra, the black substance. So this is the substantia nigra. Here, the neurons, they contain a pigment that is in one way or another is related to melanin pigment of the skin. So this is present in these neurons, and these neurons are implicated in the pathology of Parkinson's disease, the disease where the patient will have tremors, because these they control the involuntary muscular activity. So if they are affected, then the patient will have tremors, and the disease is called Parkinson's disease, which mainly affects these neurons that are present here and contain this melanin called neuromelanin. Is related to melanin in the substantia nigra of the midbrain. So far about the brainstem. Just to wrap up, we have the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brainstem that contains these pyramidal fibers. It contains also the cardiovascular center and the respiratory center, and it contains some nuclei like nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, which are sensory nuclei, in addition to the ascending and descending fibers. And then we have the pons, the bridge, that contains nuclei, ascending and descending fibers, and has connections with the cerebellum. And then we have the midbrain, which has the colliculi posteriorly, which are related to visual and auditory reflexes. It has the cerebral aqueduct inside, which connects the third and fourth ventricles. And it has the substantia nigra, these neurons which have the melanin-like pigment and implicated in Parkinson's disease. And it has the cerebral peduncles, which contain descending fibers. The diencephalon is located above the brainstem. That is the region of the diencephalon. It consists of two main parts. There are other subdivisions, but these are the main subdivisions, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And obviously from the name, hypothalamus means below. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And so we have two diencephalons on either side. When they come close together near the midline, they will surround the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle here. It is the cavity of the diencephalon. So you will expect to find a diencephalon here and a diencephalon there, in the depth, of course. So in between them is the third ventricle. So that's why we mentioned here that the diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle. The superior part is the thalamus, and the inferior part is the hypothalamus, as the name indicates. The thalamus again contains nuclei. Again, reminding you, these are not nuclei of a cell. They are a collection of nerve cell bodies that have specific function. So actually, the thalamus is considered as a hub for sensory reflexes or for sensory pathways. All sensations, before they reach the cerebral cortex to be recognized, all these sensations, they have to pass through the thalamus, except olfaction. So all the other, vision, hearing, touch, all the other sensations, they have to be to pass through the thalamus, and then from the thalamus they are connected to the cerebral cortex. So it is a hub for sensations, and also in addition to that, it receives impulses and controls some motor activity as well, because it is connected to the cerebellum and to the basal nuclei. I'm going to talk about cerebellum and basal nuclei next time, okay? So just keep them in mind. These have motor function. They control involuntary motor activity, like the tone of muscle and things like that. So they are controlled with involuntary motor activity. So it has sensory and motor functions. Multiple nuclei, each part of the thalamus has a specific function, and generally they are motor and sensory. As far as sensations are concerned, it is a hub for all sensory fibers except olfaction. The hypothalamus is located below the thalamus, and as you can see that there are multiple nuclei, different colors here, and it has a lot of functions actually. Mainly it is controlling the autonomic functions, and also it controls the endocrine activities. You can see that below, we will talk about that later on with the endocrine system. There is the pituitary gland here, and these nuclei which are present in the hypothalamus, some of them they have control over the pituitary gland, and the pituitary is controlling all the other glands in the body. But yet some other nuclei, they directly secrete into the blood. So that's why it is mentioned here that the hypothalamus has influences on the endocrine system, and these influences could be direct or indirect influences. Indirect, it could be through the pituitary gland, and direct because it secretes hormones directly to the circulation. And it plays an important role in emotion, behavior, and learning. Feeding, it contains a center. One of these nuclei is named the satiety center, the thirst center, so a sleep center, like it controls the biological watch. So all these activities are present in the hypothalamus. It's a very important part of the brain. Now, going up into the cerebrum, you can see here that in the cerebrum, there is a cortex, which is gray matter, and inside there is white matter. It's the opposite to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the white matter is outside, and the gray matter is the capital H shape or butterfly of gray matter is inside. Here it's the opposite. The cortex, which is a thin layer of gray matter that contains the cell bodies, nerve cell bodies, unmyelinated axons, and dendrites. They are located in the outermost part, and the white matter is inside. And as you can see here, that there are multiple folds and grooves. These are called the gyri and sulci. So the grooves are called the sulci or sulci, and the folds are called the gyri. And obviously, these sulci and gyri, they increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. So for example, you will not find these sulci and gyri as complicated in the rats if you compare the brain of the rats with the brain of the human. Taking into consideration the size, of course, the size will be comparable to the size of the body, but when you take out the brain of a rat, you will find that it's almost smooth. It doesn't have these sulci, much of these sulci and gyri and so on. But in the human, it's about like two-thirds of the cortex is hidden in these grooves, in these sulci. So this means that it increases the surface area of the brain for a given size. And that's the reason that we have these sulci and gyri. And in addition to that, there are deeper sulci, which are called fissures. So we have a fissure, for example, in the middle, which is called the longitudinal fissure, that separates between the two cerebral hemispheres. So this is one cerebral hemisphere, the other cerebral hemisphere. You can easily separate between them because there is a deep fissure. They don't call it a sulcus, it's a fissure. A sulcus is less deep than the fissure. And of course, when you separate these two hemispheres, they are not separable immediately because there are some white fibers connecting between the two cerebral hemispheres. These are called commissural fibers. They connect one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere, and they cross the midline. So these are called commissural fibers. The biggest bundle of these commissural fibers is called the corpus callosum. So this is the corpus callosum here. This C-shaped structure is called the corpus callosum. It is, in fact, its axons crossing from one side of the brain, one cerebral hemisphere, to the other side of cerebral hemisphere. There are multiple fibers crossing in other places, but this is, as I mentioned, it is the biggest bunch of white matter connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum. You can see it in this here again. This is the corpus callosum, and here again you can see, yeah, this one. This is another corpus callosum. See, it's a very big bundle of fibers that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. The corpus callosum. And then each cerebral hemisphere is subdivided into lobes. And these lobes, they have the names of the bones of the skull that are close to them. Remember, we have the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and temporal bone in the calvaria of the skull. So here we have these lobes of the brain. So the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, which is located posteriorly, and then inferiorly we have the temporal lobes. And these lobes are separated by either fissures or by sulci. So one of the famous sulci in the brain is the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus. It separates between the frontal and parietal lobes. Between the frontal and parietal lobes. All these sulci and gyri, most of them, if not all of them, they are named. But we are not going to go into details of these names. I'm just giving you some examples. So like, for example, the central sulcus separates between the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain. The gyrus that is immediately in front of the central sulcus, it's called the precentral gyrus. And the gyrus that is immediately behind the central sulcus is called the post-central gyrus. I'm mentioning these names because these gyri have specific functions. So like the precentral gyrus is related to motor activities, and the post-central gyrus is related to sensation. So there is certain parts of the cortex, they have specific functions, either sensory or motor, but there are many other areas that have integration functions. So they are called association areas. And here we have another sulcus, which is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. In fact, the parieto-occipital sulcus cannot be seen on the outside of the brain, on the lateral surface of the brain, but it can be seen on the medial aspect of the brain, as you can see it here, for example, just to show it to you here. Yeah. So this is the parieto-occipital sulcus. It can be seen on the medial side of the brain, but it is just projected in this diagram. It is projected on the lateral surface of the brain. The parieto-occipital sulcus, as its name indicates, it separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. That's why it's called the parieto-occipital sulcus. While the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and then we have the lateral sulcus here, which below it is the temporal lobe, below the lateral sulcus. So these are the most important sulci that are present, and I just gave you two examples of the names of gyri, precentral and postcentral gyrus. We're going to return to these names later on when we talk about the motor system and the sensory system. And in addition to that, there is a hidden area of cortex. This is the area, this is the region, the hidden part of the brain is called the insula. A small area that is hidden. You cannot see it from the outer side, from the lateral side. So here, it is not seen, but it is hidden. Can you see the shadow here? You have to separate the lateral sulcus, and you will see that there is a hidden part of the cortex with sulci and gyri inside, and this hidden part of the cerebral cortex is called the insula. As I mentioned, that parts of the cerebral cortex, they have functions. These functions could be motor. like this area, which is called the primary motor area. And this one is called the primary sensory area. So they could be motor, they could be sensory, or they could be association and integration area. So for example, here we have primary somatosensory area, this area. This is, no, the association one. What is that? Where is the association? Is this the association? Yeah, so that's the association area here. This sensory association, I'm just giving you an example of what is meant by association. So for example, now I'm putting my hand in my pocket and I feel something, and that thing is metallic, it is circular, I can move it, it has a ring, and so then I will calculate and integrate all these information, sensory information, and I know now that it is my flash drive without looking at it. Multiple sensory information were integrated. The elementary sensations will be felt in the primary sensory areas, and then these sensations altogether will be integrated in association areas. So these association areas, they integrate the information. They are related to memory, they are related to emotions, judgment, insight, things like that. It's not always on and off, 0 and 1. It's not like that. It's not a computer, okay? So, like for example here, the entire frontal, the most prefrontal cortex, this is a big association area that is related to judgment, insight, and to personality and intelligence and so on. Okay, so part of the brain is motor, part of it is sensory, and there's a very big part which is association, integrative in function. Just to give you other examples of the functional localization in the brain, give you the example of the speech and language areas. So there is an area here on the frontal lobe. This is the central sulcus. So this is the lower part of the frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe is in front of the central sulcus. And this area is called the Broca's area. Broca is the name of a person, a French neurologist. So it is the motor speech area. This is when I'm talking now, then this area is giving information to the motor areas which are present in the precentral gyrus, in order that my larynx opens and closes, my tongue is moving. So these informations are is dictated by Broca's area, and usually this motor area is present in what we call the dominant hemisphere. So the dominant hemisphere, usually it is the left hemisphere is dominant. Usually, most of the people, they have their left hemisphere is the dominant. Dominant hemisphere means that it contains the language areas. The other hemisphere does not contain the language areas. So this is the motor area here, and this is the other area in the temporal lobe. It's called the Wernicke's area, or Wernicke's, or Wernicke. So whatever you like to call it, it's Wernicke. In German, it's W is V, so it's Wernicke's area. And this is the sensory speech area, or sensory language area. Okay? And it is responsible for the interpretation of speech, whether the written speech or whether the speech that you hear. Now you are hearing me now, you understand, you interpret that using your Wernicke's area. So if these areas are affected, for example, if the Broca's area is affected, then I can hear you, I can understand you, but I cannot formulate an answer. I cannot speak the answer, because this formulation of the answer, the motor part of the answer, is dictated by this area. But if the Wernicke's area is affected, then I will not be able to understand you, I will not be able to understand what is written in a book, but yet I can still talk, because the motor area is not affected, and so on. And these two areas here, the angular gyrus and supramarginal gyrus, are the association part. As I mentioned, it's not like only motor and sensory. There are association and integration areas. So this is related to the association, memory. When I hear a sound, I can remember that the voice belongs to that person or the other person. So these integrative areas. The emotional part of speech is also integrated by these areas, and so on. Okay? We're not machines after all. The last slide is to concentrate on the hemispheric lateralization. As I mentioned, that we say that one cerebral hemisphere is dominant and the other is non-dominant hemisphere. This might give you the impression that the dominant hemisphere is the intelligent one, but the non-dominant hemisphere is the dumb one. This is not true, because each hemisphere has both hemispheres, they have common functions, but each hemisphere is unique in certain functions. It just happened that when they named the dominant hemisphere as a dominant hemisphere, is that it contains the speech areas, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, while it's not located on the other side. Most of us are right-handed, and the dominant hemisphere is located is the left dominant hemisphere, but even 90% of left-handed people, they have their dominant hemisphere is on the left, because the dominant hemisphere is the hemisphere that contains the speech areas, motor and sensory speech areas. So these language areas are present in the dominant hemisphere. Non-dominant hemisphere is inferior in language functions, but it is superior in other functions. It is the non-dominant hemisphere, which is usually the right, is more artistic. So when you hear the music, you taste that music by your right hemisphere. When you look at a painting, for example, you admire that painting and the art behind it. This is done in the right cerebral hemisphere. This one, the left cerebral hemisphere, is more of mathematical, calculative. It's not artistic, but it's called dominant because it contains the language areas. So these are the specific functions or unique functions that are allocated to these hemispheres. Otherwise, like motor activity, sensory activity is present in both hemispheres, and those two hemispheres are connected with each other by commissural fibers. Remember the corpus callosum, which the biggest bunch of these commissural fibers. Okay? Any question? Yes?
You said that within the brain it can't regenerate. What do they mean when they say like brain plasticity?
Brain?
Plasticity? That it's like...
Brain plasticity in the nervous system in general is that there are changing connections. The neurons, they cannot regenerate themselves, but they can change their connections. So they will change the type of, you remember the networks that we were talking about in the histology part? So they can change with time. They can change. That's what they term the plasticity of the nervous system. It's not regeneration, but different connections and different networks. Okay?